This is another episode of American TV with Mitchell Hadley. I'm Dan Schneider, and after doing some shows on decades of TV and then on some other topics, another way we're going to be expanding is doing shows that focus on important individuals in the formation and the history of the television medium. The first person that we are going to be addressing is a man that probably most people under the age of 40 at the outside have no idea existed, but who was one of the top 10 or 12 television producers of all times in terms of success on the television medium in the 50s, 60s, and 70s mostly. With that having been said, the show will be on a man named Quinn Martin. So let me turn it over to my colleague, Mitchell Hadley. Mitch, first, if you could just give a little background about yourself, and then just open up with a little bit about who Quinn Martin was and why he was important.
Sure, it's good to see you again, Dan. Thanks very much for having me on. Mitchell Hadley. I am a blog about classic television at the website itsabouttv.com, and I have authored 3 books, including The Electronic Mirror, which is a look at what classic television says about our past and our future and everything in between. My forthcoming book, which will be out hopefully by the end of this year, is called The Descent into Hell, which is a look at classic television's prophecy of today's brave new world. So Quinn Martin dealt with a very different world, I think, as we see when we look at some of his shows in detail, but a very interesting one. As you said, he was arguably the most influential television producer of the 1970s, 60s and 70s, but he really became a dominant force in the early 70s, and we'll talk about that. He was born in 1922, lived until 1987, died of cancer. He started out at MGM, where he was a film editor, as his father before him was, and he worked with his father for a time. His rise to prominence, oddly enough, began with a project which does not bear his name and is not generally associated with him unless you know a little more about the background of the show. It was a show for Desilu Productions. He was an executive producer at Desilu at the time, and it was called The Untouchables. And I'm sure many of our viewers are familiar with The Untouchables, the story of Elliot Ness and his fight against organized crime during the years of Prohibition. He was the executive producer for that show, and as such, his name does not appear in the opening title. It's always referred to as a Desilu production, but otherwise it has all the hallmarks that we would recognize, that we would come to recognize in the future from a Quinn Martin production. And when I talk about the hallmarks of a QM production, and that's what many people would remember hearing it called, it opens with a statement of the show, the stars of the show, the guest stars, the show's title is always given in the voiceover at the beginning, and then the episode itself is split into 4 acts, and going forward, they would actually be identified: Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4. That did not happen with The Untouchables because the show had a narrator, Walter Winchell, and so Winchell often served the function of coming back from the commercial break with some kind of description of what was going on. But in every other respect, The Untouchables is a prototype Quinn Martin show. It has a very distinguished guest star cast, a nice mixture of very well-known and recognizable character actors, and actors who would become big stars in TV or in the movies as the years go by. They may just be getting their start right now. You may recognize them more if you see the show in reruns than you would have at the time. But they're all very talented. It's a very literate show. The scripts are, in general, well done. It was a controversial show for its time because of the violent content of the show. What passed for violence in those days, I think we would probably find fairly tame in comparison. But for the time, it was considered a very violent show. It also was controversial for its depiction of Italian Americans as being behind the mafia, organized crime, the Cosa Nostra. And it was controversial to the extent that at one point Frank Sinatra threatened to get Desi Arnaz because of his production company doing the show. So over time, some of the overtones of the Italian-American stereotype were toned down a bit. But the show ran for 4 years. By the time the show went off the air, Martin had left Desilu to start his own production company, Quinn Martin Productions. But I think that it remains one of the feathers in his cap, and was a brilliant introduction to the type of show that Quinn Martin would become well known for throughout the 60s and 70s.
Martin, as you said, was born in 22, just a couple of years after Rod Serling. And like Serling, he was Jewish, served in World War II. What was some of the hallmark, or were there any events that we know about in his early life that led him to television?
Well, as I mentioned, one of the things that is interesting about him is that he followed essentially in his father's footsteps in getting into the moving picture business, getting into movies. So that attracted him. He worked with several studios, different groups during that time. He was a film editor at MGM, so he was working on some of their television products. He worked at Universal Studios during the same time. And as he grew in experience within the television industry, that's how he found himself at Desilu Studios, which was just rising in prominence off of I Love Lucy, Desilu Playhouse, which is where The Untouchables got its start. And it was becoming a powerful independent producer in the television industry. So Martin was a good fit for that, and it gave him a chance to really be able to work on the concept of the shows that he wanted to work on. As a matter of fact, his first wife was actually part of the writing team behind I Love Lucy. So there was a very strong connection between Martin and Desilu and Desilu's product by the time that he took over The Untouchables.
You also mentioned the famed formula that many of his shows followed. Did all of them follow it? And if so, did they, as they got into the 70s, was that seen as more archaic to follow that kind of formula?
You know, it was always something that was ripe for parody, not because it was silly or stupid, but because it was so recognizable. So if you watch, for instance, a show like Police Squad, where each portion of the half hour is introduced with Act 1, Act 2. They also have these absurd subtitles, Act 2, Gesundheit. But it is something that is easy to parody. They've done it on Mystery Science Theater. They've done it on many other shows. As I say, it isn't a parody out of it being silly or stupid as much as it just being very recognizable. You talk about in history of film and television, you tend to talk about cliches, but cliches get their start somewhere. And just as Shane provides so many of the Western cliches that we see in movies, Quinn Martin's early shows provided the cliches that we would go on to see. Only they weren't cliches at the time. He was really defining a style of television there was a certain, I think, an aggressiveness, an assertiveness to the opening titles, a sense of drama, an ability to be able to capture the essence of what the show was about, whether those titles made you nervous or whether they created this soaring spirit of being in the wild blue yonder as they did in 12 O'Clock High, or the FBI, one of my favorite ones, where it gives you this absolute vision of the grandeur of authority in Washington, or any of his other shows. They all have a very distinctive touch within the oeuvre that Martin works on, but they're all very unique to Martin, and to the extent that they're copied, parodied, they all come back to him as the genesis of the style.
Yeah, and he's works probably 90% or more of his series were crime dramas. There are a couple of sci-fi and one horror show there. What was it that drew Martin to the crime drama?
I'm not sure if there was any one thing. I look back at the FBI, for instance, which was his first crime drama from besides the Untouchables. It was the first crime drama he did that really was very successful. He had done a previous crime show called The New Breed. We might get into that in passing, but that was a single season show, and as far as his total body of work, it isn't terribly significant. But by the time you get to the FBI, he's established that reputation for working on crime shows, and the FBI wanted him to be the executive producer for this show. He was a little reluctant to do that. He was not politically aligned with the FBI. He wasn't politically aligned with J. Edgar Hoover, and they were, no, you don't have to worry about that. What they want you to do is get the show right. They'll give you all the cooperation. They'll give you all the case files to be able to draw scripts from. They don't want this to be a propaganda piece. They want it to be an entertaining drama. And of course, it was entertaining. And in so doing, it did become kind of a propaganda piece for the FBI, but that was never, I don't think it was certainly not Quinn Martin's intent, and it was never the intent of the program. It just became such a well-respected show that its presentation of the FBI, certainly for several years, became kind of canon.
Yeah, there's also sort of what we might call the Quinn Martin prototypical hero / anti-hero, whether we're talking The Fugitive, whether we're talking Dan August. These were not wimpy people. Even
right.
William Conrad, who was an oversized human being, was not a pushover. The way some other, compare that to like Perry Mason or what is it, Dragnet.
Yep.
What set a Quinn Martin hero apart from others in the genre?
Well, you're right that a Quinn Martin hero is a very masculine male. He's not a brute or savage, but he's very masculine. Whether you're talking about David Jansen in The Fugitive, or Robert Lansing, I'm sorry, in the first season of 12 O'Clock High, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. in the FBI. I think even Buddy Ebsen in Barnaby Jones, when we move into the mid-70s, there is something about him that he is very much a masculine, strong male figure, kind of a father figure, but a very masculine figure nonetheless. Now, when you look at the heroes overall, they are men of action. Even somebody like Frank Cannon actually gets around fairly well. He's a big man, but like many big men, I think William Conrad had a certain lightness on his feet. He also had the very authoritative voice that a Quinn Martin hero would have. And I think that that's something that you can't really just dismiss out of hand as coincidental. If you look at all of these men that I've mentioned, and even when you go back to his first series, The New Breed, where you have Leslie Nielsen as the police detective who is the focal character in the show. These are all men that speak with a gravitas, an authority. I think what makes The Fugitive interesting in a way is that it kind of goes against the grain of a typical Martin hero in that Richard Kimball, who is on the run, literally running for his life, running from the police, running to try to catch the man he saw flee the scene of the murder of his wife. He has a true vulnerability. He's vulnerable not only in the sense that he could be spotted and picked up by the police at any time, but he is vulnerable in that he has to open himself up to people many times in order to secure their help, to be able to escape the police or to be able to get closer to the one-armed man. He has a certain vulnerability that most Quinn Martin heroes don't have. I would say that Roy Thinnes, in a way, is another. Roy Thinnes was the protagonist of The Invaders, which is a very unusual Quinn Martin story in some respects, I think. It's science fiction, which is a decidedly different motif than most of his other shows. And he is in a position more like Richard Kimball, in that he is trying to convince people to believe him, that believe me that I saw this flying saucer, that there are aliens in this world trying to assume the identities of human beings, that they're trying to take over the planet, and coming back again to this refrain of, you've got to believe me. And he does show his vulnerability because he's dependent on these people, excuse me, he's dependent on these people either to succeed in his cause or to protect him in case the invaders, who know what he's up to and are out to get him, are able to track him down. He has to turn some of the invaders from time to time. He has to convince skeptical people that he's not insane. So these are two Martin heroes that are really, I think, while they have all the qualities in terms of acting that a typical Martin hero has, they're a little different in that they project a moral authority, but they are much more vulnerable, both personally and in the sense of what they reveal to other people than most of them. I know that I was talking with my wife about this once. In the 9 years that the FBI was run, we had exactly one scene in which we saw the interior of Ephraim Zimbalist Jr.'s apartment. We had one or two episodes, one I think, but at the most two, where there was any suggestion of a love interest or a love life in the life of Zimbalist's character. That's more of a typical type of a Quinn Martin hero. It's all about the story. It's all about the guest stars, the generator, the straw that mixes the drink is the star, but a lot of times the focus is on the guest star and what's happening in his or her life, not in the life of the star.
I believe we also in the past talked about Hawaii Five-0, and a Quinn Martin star is someone like Jack Lord's McGarry.
Yes.
But it's interesting because at the same time, it seemed to be a sort of a shrinking bastion of what the hero in television was, because around the same time in the late 60s, early 70s, you were getting people like Columbo and Rockford and then later Magnum and Matlock and Jessica Fletcher. And one of the things, other than going more deeply into these characters' personal lives, with the exception of Columbo, is that you are often bereft of humor in most
Yep.
Quinn Martin productions.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't get the wink of the Tom Magnum character, or the overall wandering about machinations to lay his trap like Columbo. You didn't get the personal little snide remarks that you would get from a Jim Rockford. Do you think that eventually the Quinn Martin hero just sort of was out of touch with America?
I think that you can make a pretty convincing case for that. Certainly, a certain segment of America was looking for a more sensitive hero or a more earthy hero. If you want to put it in more negative terms, you might be talking about a less wooden or static actor. That's one of the reasons why I think arguably the best actor that Quinn Martin ever worked with was David Janssen,
Yeah.
because he would have been able to portray any kind of character that the role called for. If you look later into the 70s in Janssen's detective show Harry O, which a lot of people I have discovered mistakenly think is a Quinn Martin
Yeah.
production, but it isn't. He's still brittle around the edges, but there's a humanity, especially in the rebooted version of Harry O, that attests to Janssen's character, but also sets it apart from the kind of character a Quinn Martin hero was. If you look at the list of the Quinn Martin shows, I think the last network show he had on the air was in 1979. It was a secret agent series called A Man Called Sloan, and Robert Conrad was the star of that. There's your Quinn Martin hero at the end of the 70s as a character like him. Or if you go to Most Wanted, which had, I think Robert Stack was in that, and of course Stack was also in The Untouchables. If you look at Codename Diamond Head, which was a made-for-TV movie, but it was actually a pilot that was intended to be a weekly series, there you've got Roy Thinnis again, who worked with Martin in The Invaders. So you had so in addition to having a certain kind of actor that Martin liked to work with, you had a stable of actors, either as stars or as guest stars, that would appear with some degree of frequency in Quinn Martin productions. To come back to your original question, yes, I think that the market was changing, and I think the fact that Martin's last few series were not that successful, none of them went beyond a season. You had Burt D'Angelo, Superstar, with Paul Sorvino, who is not a prototypical Quinn Martin hero, although I don't want to say that he wasn't tough. He was, but there you're starting to get somebody who again can suggest a little nuance, and I think maybe Martin is trying to adjust to the changing times, but by the time we come to 1980, it's certainly a different environment than what we had before. Maybe not quite as violent, maybe a little more cynical, maybe a little more sardonic. As you said, somebody like Jim Rockford becomes the type of a private eye character that you see in the shows. So by that time, Quinn Martin has had a good run. He, but he, after Barnaby Jones, he never again has a hugely successful weekly series. He has a number of other series. I think he has at least a half a dozen that come after Barnaby Jones. That's his last successful one, though.
Mitch, let's turn to take a look at a brief look at the various shows. You mentioned The New Breed. That was on from 61 to 62. This, you said, it's a success to get any television on for a series, but it was a mild success. What do you think was the issue that it did catch on?
Well, it could have been anything. It could have been its time slot. It could have been simply the fact that although it was promising to be talk about the new breed of law enforcement officials, people who are, college graduates or using scientific evidence, different things like that. Even though you have factors like that, and you have Leslie Nielsen in his pre-Police Squad days, who was a really fine dramatic actor. I don't think there was anything terribly special about it. It was up against the Red Skelton show, which I think probably did it no favors. And it had a lot of the Quinn Martin team working on it, whether in front of or behind the cameras. But it didn't present anything that was either unusual or stand out enough to separate itself from what else was on. Perhaps in a different time spot, it would have been better, because really, having seen a couple of episodes of it, it's not a bad series, but it isn't anything that's terribly different from other series of its type.
The Fugitive, people don't seem to recognize. They know the film from what, the 90s, was it?
Yeah.
But they don't realize how popular The Fugitive got as it built. The Fugitive was one of the few serialized dramas of
Yeah.
that day. It wasn't a pure serial, but it had the serial elements because the man is on the run, and it led to a lot of these other shows. Whether we're talking The Prisoner from England, whether we're talking about a handful of other shows in the 60s that have someone who is either misunderstood, doesn't know who they are, and has to find the truth somehow. And David Jansen, as you mentioned, was an interesting choice there. And I'll let you pick up on this. People don't seem to realize that its ending was before the ending of MASH, the highest rated single television episode in history to that point.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that series and specifically the actor.
Well, it's a very interesting show in so many ways. It had its own share of controversy as well when it came on the air, because for anybody who isn't terribly familiar, the premise of The Fugitive was that David Jansen played a character, Dr. Richard Kimball, and he had been arrested, accused, convicted, and sentenced to death for the murder of his wife. Now, what Kimball knew was that he had not killed his wife. He saw, he saw a one-armed man running from his home, from the scene of the crime, and then came into his home to find his wife dead there. He and his wife had quarreled previously. He'd left to cool off. He'd come back home, found her dead, and the one-armed man running away from the scene. On the train, on the way to the death house to be executed, the train derails and Kimball escapes. And for the next 4 years, the show runs along parallel tracks. You have Barry Morse playing Lieutenant Philip Gerard, trying to track down Kimball and bring him back to justice. As he says many times, I don't determine a man's guilt or innocence. I am an officer of the law. I carry out the law. Kimball was found guilty. That decision is not mine. My job is to bring him back to face the penalty. So he is chasing down Kimball, and he is a memorable character, even though he appears in fewer than half of the episodes in the series. Now, at the same time that Kimball is trying to avoid Gerard, he is trying to find the one-armed man who he believes if he can capture the one-armed man, he can force him to confess that he was the one who killed his wife. He has no evidence otherwise to suggest that. And the one-armed man also, Fred Johnson, the name of the character, Bill Raich is the name of the actor, only appears a handful of times in the first 3 seasons. But you've got these dual chases going on. The police chasing Kimball, Kimball chasing the one-armed man. And as you mentioned, the nation became absolutely enthralled with this show. And people took it to heart in a way that we are more accustomed to reading about in soap operas, where women would accost the evil bitch characters from their daily soaps. They would accost them in the grocery store or something. How can you try to break up their marriage? That kind of thing. We had the same type of reaction with The Fugitive. People would accost Barry Morse on the streets. How can you go after Dr. Kimball? He's innocent. And you had people offering to help David Jansen. And if you that of course is kind of a suspension of disbelief, but if you get down to the actual story itself, there was a fair amount of speculation as to whether the premise that we were presented in the opening title of every episode was actually true. There were some people who thought maybe Kimball did murder his wife. There were some people who thought, well, maybe Kimball is innocent, but it wasn't the one-armed man. Maybe it was Kimball's brother-in-law. Maybe it was somebody else. Maybe they hired the one-armed man to do it. So there was that kind of speculation as well. And there was a subcurrent of excitement from the very first season on as to how this series would resolve itself. Now, to your point, Quinn Martin was very much against having a final episode of The Fugitive. For one thing, with very few exceptions, it had never been done. There were only a handful of series that had ever had what we would come to think of as a proper final episode. Probably the most recent shows to have had a final episode back in that day were Leave It to Beaver and Route 66, which both wrapped up their runs fairly neatly. But so the idea that you had to have a final episode was not a common one. And in fact, Martin's biggest concern was that it would kill the resale value of the show, so to speak. When it went into syndication, people would be less likely to watch it knowing how it eventually turned out.
Yeah.
And that it would make it less sellable, less marketable. Now, he was finally persuaded to go along with having a final episode. But because that came relatively late in the going during the show's fourth and final season, the decision to film a final episode came late in that season. So they did something which had, to my knowledge, had not been done before and has seldom ever been done since. And was part of the reason why it got such an enormous audience for the final episode. They chose to show the final episode at the very end of the season, after the summer reruns had gone through. So you had the fourth season run as usual through April or May. You had the summer rerun schedule as usual for any show. And then at the very end of August, you have the two-part finale that answers all the questions, tells how the story ends, and sees Kimball go off happily ever after. And it was Quinn Martin might have been right that it might have damaged the syndication for the show, because it was never terribly successful in syndication. But that night, that final night of the final episode, when the whole story was resolved, 75% maybe of the country's television sets were tuned to that show. And the speculation was huge about what was going on, what would happen. Would Kimball turn out to be guilty? Would they catch the one-armed man? Would it be somebody else? Would it be Lieutenant Gerard who is somehow involved in it? Speculation had been running rampant. Vegas had odds on who the actual killer was. You could go to Vegas and plunk down a bet on how it was going to end. As is often the case with shows like this, it was kind of an anticlimax. It was not necessarily the best episode of The Fugitive. It introduced some things which kind of came as a surprise, characters we didn't know about before. But it was a satisfying ending. It did tie up the loose ends. and it sent Richard Kimball off into the sunset with a woman, Diane Baker, who is presumably going to become the new Mrs. Kimball in the future. But we were always left wondering exactly how his life was going to be. Would he ever stop looking over his shoulder when he heard a police siren
Yeah.
go off? Would he ever truly be
I think
freed down?
he walks away when he walks away with it. We do hear a siren.
Yes. And he stops for just a minute, and she kind of has to, hey, um, it's all okay now. But brilliant ending to the show, and a great show overall. Certainly, I think one of the great drama series of all time, and one of the things we can really credit the movie for, besides the movie being good entertainment itself, was that it began the revival of interest in the TV series. And it went on from there into home video and streaming, and now it's still not as well known as it should be, but it's certainly better known than it was.
I know a few years ago I watched a few episodes that I hadn't seen in, well, since my childhood, 50 years or more. And it's one of those shows maybe we should at some point just focus a show specifically on that. Two things I wanted to bring up that people often argue pro and con is, one, the relation to the real Sam Shepard murder case of the 1950s in Cleveland, and also the literary connection to Les Miserables by Victor Hugo.
Yes.
People argue pro and con on both points. What is your take?
Well, I think that it is a little disingenuous to suggest that the Sam Shepard murder trial didn't have something to do with the series. Sam Shepard was a doctor, like Kimball, who was accused of murdering his wife, like Kimball, was convicted, like Kimball, was not sentenced to death, but served a dozen years in prison before his conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court, thanks to a young attorney of his named F. Lee Bailey. And Shepard eventually was retried and acquitted, and had a very unhappy life after that, which I hope is not what was in store for Richard Kimball. Les Miserables really introduced the idea of the man on the run, and the police lieutenant who is obsessed with his capture. That's one of the fundamental things that Les Miserables is that is embedded in the story. And so I think that, although it may be a bit disingenuous to discount the Shepard effect, it also would be wrong to say that it does not owe some of its success to Les Mis, because clearly the structure of the pursuer and the pursued comes from that. There was no equivalent in the real-life Shepard case, because Shepard never got outside of prison until he was freed.
Now, before we move on to the other shows, I have to give my secondhand David Jansen anecdote. When I was a kid, I grew up in a very Goodfellas neighborhood, and in some of the abandoned buildings, you would have porno movies being shot. And one of those porno movies was directed by a man named Buzz Kulick, who later became famous for Brian's Song. Apparently, this was something that a lot of these directors of television before, when they didn't have work, they were making blue movies back from the post-war era through the 60s and 70s. And Kulick had actually directed in 67 or 68 a film. It was a film with Jansen. It was a Western, the name of which slips my mind. And he had this big, because me and my kid friends, we know the gangsters, and the gangsters who were funding these films would say, "Yeah, go to the pizza, get us 3 pepperoni pizzas," and they give us a couple of bucks to do it. We'd come back and, I'm seeing 1970s Bush, for the first time. But Kulick had remained pals with Jansen, and he had, other than the big movie poster, the name of which I forget, he had an autographed photograph of him and David Jansen. I was like, man, he knows a big star like David Jansen. It was just so I had to just stick that in there, even though it has nothing to do with Quinn Martin.
Great story.
But so you mentioned briefly 12 O'Clock High and the
Yeah.
FBI. Since we talked a little bit about them, to me, I'd rather talk just a little bit about the Invaders a bit more, because when you think of that era, and that ran from 67 to 68, so you have Star Trek, you have the Irwin Allen sci-fi stuff. The what was the submarine one?
Voyage to the
Voyage
Bottom
to the
of the
Bottom of
Sea.
the
Yes.
Sea, and you had a couple of other ones from him. You had from Britain. You had the puppetronic kind of things. You had
Super Marionation. Yeah.
UFO, and yet to me, the Invaders is clearly the most dark of all of these.
Hmm.
It obviously has connotations going back to Invasion of the Body Snatchers and that kind of thing, the 1950s Red Scare, commies are coming from space kind of thing. And yet I think it was a lot better than, say, what was it, the Time Tunnel, which was Irwin
Yeah.
Allen's thing, where they would sometimes
Yep.
meet up with all kinds of weird things in time. Why do you think that the Invaders? Let's see. It says it lasted only 2 seasons. Why
Yeah.
didn't it catch on? Whereas a Star Trek, well, Star Trek didn't in terms of stuff, but why didn't the Invaders become something of a franchise? A sci-fi franchise. Do you think?
Hmm. The best explanation I have read for that, and it's one that I would agree with having seen the series, it, is that beyond a certain point, every show became like every other episode. In every episode, his ultimate goal was to try to convince the authorities of this alien invasion. And in every episode, they either didn't believe him or they did believe him and they were able to defeat this on a very small scale, but it wouldn't extend out to the entire invasion force, or the people who believed him were killed, or on a much smaller scale, he had to convince one of the invaders who was holding him hostage that they needed to release him because what they were doing was wrong. But the problem was that the premise was the same over and over and over again, and there are only so many of those episodes you can do. Where the Fugitive was different, I think, my own personal opinion, where that was different was that it had an entire nation to play from, and as long as a man is on the run, there are always going to be things that are going to be happening, and somehow or other Kimball would always find himself in the middle of somebody else's story, wherever he went. Now, yeah, that does happen a bit in the Invaders too. But one one critic went so far as to talk about the ultimate Invaders DVD boxed set, and it would contain about 14 episodes, the 14 essential episodes of the series. And considering that the series was on for a year and a half, 2 years, there are a lot more episodes than that. But he felt the whole series could just be distilled down to those 14 or 16 episodes, that beyond that, it was becoming redundant. It was telling the same stories, or it wasn't advancing the storyline. Finally, in the second season, they give David Vincent, that's the architect that Roy Thinnes plays, they gave Vincent an ally. And up until then, I think you make a very good point about the darkness of the series, because it was literally David Vincent against the world, this other world. And when they introduce somebody who has money, who has resources, who has a certain amount of power, and who believes him, that does open up the possibility of a broader storyline that you can maybe take it into some places where it didn't wasn't able to go before. But I think that by that time it had just run out of steam. There wasn't much more they could do with it. And I think that's why it ultimately did not become the show that some of the others did. I don't want to call it a one-trick pony, because that always sounds kind of derogatory, but without using it in a negative connotation, that's really what it was. And Roy Thinnes was not as dynamic an actor as David Janssen was. He wasn't as compelling a character as David Janssen's was. And so some of the things that kept The Fugitive from getting into that terrain, at least until the final season or so, didn't exist to help the invaders. It is a very good series, but I would agree with this assessment that you can take the best episodes of the series, put them together, and you don't really need to see the others.
Yeah, let's talk about the 1970s because that's really the heyday of when Quinn Martin came into his own. There are basically three, it looks like, really successful series: Cannon, Streets of San Francisco, and Barnaby Jones.
Yep.
The rest pretty much failed. The one notable exception, simply because of the star, was Dan August, and this was Burt Reynolds, somewhere between his Western days and his performance in Deliverance, which made him a star. Before we get into the three big ones, was that the reason that Dan August came to an end because Burt Reynolds just walked off the set, or was it flagging in ratings?
Well, I think that part of the problem with Dan August was that it wasn't, it isn't the only TV series that Burt Reynolds had that didn't work. He'd had a previous police series that he had been in as well. Now, I'm trying to remember the name of that one, but the Hawk, that was it, and he was a detective in that one as well. And so I don't know that we should consider Dan August an outlier so much. It was another series that Reynolds was in that didn't do very well. But now when the show ends, which is I think in 1971, when the show ends, he goes off into his movie career. The show's not popular enough to be renewed, and so he goes off into his movie career. He becomes a star, becomes a genuine movie star, and at that point, Dan August starts to catch on again, and because they show it in reruns. And they show it on CBS in the late night movie slot. They show it in prime time during the summer, in both 73 and 74. So this is 2-3 years after the show had originally gone off the air, and it has an entirely new life at that point. The show isn't any different. It's not better because 2 or 3 years have passed. It's because Burt Reynolds is different. He's Burt Reynolds now. And that's what I suspect that today, if something like this happened, well, you wouldn't get Reynolds back to do television, but this is the example of a show that had there been streaming services or had it been in the golden age of prestige TV, that might be the kind of a show that would have had a second life. It might have been brought back. Now, as I say, I don't think that this specific show would have been, because he's off doing Deliverance, Smokey and the Bandit, all these things. He's not going to do TV again. But it's an example of a show that had a second wind, and under different circumstances, it might have been able to come back and start over again, because it wasn't a bad show. It just didn't click. I think there's a line I had down here about that Reynolds said when he took the role. He said that I swore I'd never play a cop on TV because you can't make jokes or have women. And he said you wind up loving your car a lot. And he said I was halfway out the door when Quinn said the magic words, 15,000 a week. And so that's what brought him in to do Dan August. So I think it just, he wasn't Burt Reynolds yet. It wasn't a special show. It was a good show, but it wasn't a breakout.
Well, he was able to do comedy with women 20 years later on Evening Shade. But
again, I think that goes back a little bit to what you're talking about with the prototypical Quinn Martin show too.
So then we come to probably one of the most odd shows that I can recall from my youth is William Conrad as Cannon. And the reason I say it's odd is before that, William Conrad, as far as I know, was mostly an announcer. He wasn't even a B player. He gets the starring role, and it seems to have been a '70s thing where later he became the Fat Man in
Jake and the Fat
Jake and
Man.
the Fat
Yep.
Man, and then you had the suddenly rotund what's his name as Ironside sitting in the chair.
Yeah, Raymond Burr.
Raymond
Yeah.
Burr. So this is an odd show just in terms of its hero, and like we said, he doesn't have the humor of Columbo, and yet it lasted what 5 seasons.
hmm Well, I think that one of the things that William Conrad had going for him, he had a fabulous career in radio. He was the original Matt Dillon on Gunsmoke when
Yeah.
that premiered on radio. He had been in a few movies. He was one of the killers in the original version of Hemingway's The Killers. He had been the narrator on Rocky and Bullwinkle and was greatly loved in that role. And he had been the narrator on The Fugitive. So he had a history with Quinn Martin. And what Cannon offered was kind of, as you were describing it, I kind of thought about what we had said previously when you had mentioned Jim Rockford. A Cannon was almost a Rockford-esque type of character in that he was not the traditional heroic, virile detective. He was overweight. He was balding. He was a gourmet cook. Um, he was a retired policeman, so he had the credentials there. But what he did have, what Bill Conrad as an actor had in this series, you didn't get to see it very often in his movie roles because he played a lot of heavies in the things where we've seen him. And Marshall Dillon, of course, was a fairly humorless character as characters go. But Frank Cannon was a man of great warmth. Conrad exuded warmth as Cannon. I don't mean that he didn't take things seriously. I don't mean that he was a chuckle a minute, but I mean that he was a warm human individual with great empathy for his clients and a determination to try to do them right. And I think that made him a very popular character on television, beside the fact that he was so unconventional as any of the other detectives. He was a great character, and Conrad did such a very nice job playing him. There's an interesting thing about the opening credits for Cannon that play on the basic theme of the graphics for the show. It's emphasizing the O in the word cannon, which could be seen as the mouth of a cannon or anything else. And inside that O, you have the portrait of Cannon that then spins out into introducing the characters. But you have this circle motif that goes through the graphics, and you see different aspects of Cannon. You see different body parts. You see his ear, you see his forehead, you see some different things. Now, some people have made fun of that opening scene, and I don't agree with that, because I think what it's talking about is what makes Cannon an excellent detective is that he uses everything. He uses his mind. He uses his hearing. He listens to what's going on. His instinct. He knows that he doesn't necessarily have the physicality or the presence to be able to stop criminals, but he can outthink them. He can out-experience them. He can trick them. He can draw them out into the open, and he can beat them up when the time comes. He hit a few people with his stomach, as I recall. So he was a tough character. In the fifth and final season of Cannon, consciously or subconsciously, they try something at the beginning of the season where they make Cannon more cynical and less likable, a little crankier with his clients. Now, frankly, Yeah, I own the series. I've seen all the episodes. There were some clients I thought he should have slapped around during the first 4 seasons of the series because they were absolute imbeciles. But you lose some of the warmth and some of the humanity that makes Cannon such an attractive and appealing character. And I don't know that that had anything to do with why the show was canceled at the end of that season, if it was a cause or if it was an effect. But I find this last season of Canon to not be very satisfying because you lose the very things that make it work.
Now, Streets of San Francisco, when I was a kid growing up, I always thought that was basically just Hawaii Five-O in San Francisco, because he had a similar setup with, as you mentioned, the Michael Douglas character
Yep.
was sort of the Dano to Ephraim
hmm
Zimbalist's character.
Yeah, what's interesting about this is that we've talked about the prototypical uh, Quinn Martin type of hero. And in this case, what you have is something that's almost constructed along the lines of a show like Dr. Kildare or Ben Casey,
Yeah.
where you have Carl Malden playing the older cop who is the mentor to Michael Douglas, the younger cop. Now, you've also got a dichotomy in the two characters. Douglas is the character that we really do learn things about. We see his girlfriends, we see his private life more than we would a typical Quinn Martin character, perhaps. But you see Malden's character representing that more traditional Martin character, I think. Now, it's been a while since I've seen Streets, but that always struck me that you kind of had the past and the present, or the present and the future of the Quinn Martin franchise in that show. That you had these two halves of the same coin of law enforcement: the more serious side, the lighter side, the fatherly side, the young up and coming passion of the younger side. And it's a very interesting and very successful combination, I think. Less successful after Michael Douglas leaves the show. And who knew? Who knew that he would become the star that he became? Maybe it was obvious at the time, but certainly he went on to a phenomenal career after it.
Yeah, I misspoke. I meant Malden, not Ephraim Zimbalist. He was in the FBI. Now, to me, another oddball, not quite as odd as Cannon, is Buddy Ebsen as Barnaby Jones. That was quite a bit more successful than Cannon, I think, ratings wise, because Buddy Ebsen, as far as I know, was before this, you know, maybe not a B actor. He had his biggest claim to fame, though, was probably that he got sick while playing the Tin Woodsman, or trying out for the Tin Woodsman for the Wizard of Oz all those years earlier. And then here he is now in his 70s or what, at least mid to late 60s when the show comes on. He's almost as bizarre a hero as is Cannon.
Well, of course, what Ebsen did have going for him was all those years on Beverly Hillbillies,
Yeah,
and that had turned him into a beloved star of a sort. And what Barnaby Jones was, though, was a change of pace for him, because it is a drama, it is kind of an action type show, although he certainly is not an action oriented actor. But that, interestingly enough, is a spin-off from Canon, and so there was a crossover episode there that presented the two of them working together on a case. But I think that Barnaby Jones presents another difference from the traditional Quinn Martin show, in that it is an ensemble drama. You have Barnaby, you have his daughter, and you have, what was the kid, was the kid his nephew or something? I'm
Matlock played off of that again with a sitcom
yeah.
star becoming a.
Yeah, because Barnaby's son, who had succeeded his father in running the firm, had been murdered on a case, and Barnaby comes out of retirement to catch his killer. So that has a pretty good concept, and it's definitely a much lower key show. And Buddy Ebsen is not going to be involved in the action to the extent that a lot of these other guys are, like, Robert Forster and Banyan, for example. But there are when you read about Barnaby Jones now. The series evokes very warm memories among people who grew up watching it, and they will remember watching it with their parents, with their father particularly, because it was a show that appealed to an older demographic. Had it been airing in the 60s, it would have been a victim of the rural purge, I'm sure, just as the Beverly Hillbillies was. But people have very fond memories of that. They have a genuine affection for Buddy Ebsen, and Lee Merriweather was, as vivacious as ever in that series. And so it had a solid cast, it had a good premise, it was a different kind of a Quinn Martin production, but it, as you mentioned, was a very successful one.
So
His last really successful series.
yeah, it's a series of just one season or less shows,
Yeah.
with the exception of The Runaways. And so I want to talk about that one just briefly, and also The Tales of the Unexpected, which is a horror. Was that an anthology show?
It was, yes. The Runaways, I actually have never had an opportunity to see. It was on at a time in my life when I lived in a town which my readers will recognize. I've described it as the world's worst town. We had a very limited television access, and that was one of the shows that we either did not get, or if we did get it, I wasn't in a position to be able to watch it. But Tales of the Unexpected was a kind of a horror anthology series. It was a real change of pace for Quinn Martin because it doesn't have anything that Quinn Martin usually has except the construct itself. It doesn't have the heroes. It doesn't have the storyline. It's very different. It wasn't a bad show. If you catch some of the episodes of it that are around, it's actually not bad. And I say that about a lot of shows, but it's true. A lot of shows are not bad. Some of them are real stinkers, and I don't think this one was. There were only 8 episodes of it, I think. But it certainly, if Quinn Martin was looking for a vehicle to bring him his next big hit, he could have been playing off of the horror genre of the time, but it didn't attract the audience.
So, what is the legacy of Quinn Martin? Has there, in the 40 plus years intervening since his last show went off the air, has there been any television producer that fills that niche, or has that niche simply just withered away because America moved on?
Well, I think what you see in television today, the major domo in any TV series nowadays tends to be the showrunner, who assumes a position sort of that's a combination producer, scriptwriter, owner of the show. And they have a personal involvement in the show that is much different from what Quinn Martin had. I think that if you were to talk about a successor to Quinn Martin, the name that would first come to mind would be Aaron Spelling, who had an even longer and more successful career than Quinn Martin over time. I don't know that he had such a concentrated period of time where you had The Fugitive, The FBI, Cannon, Barnaby Jones, Streets of San Francisco, but I would say that the one who approaches that is somebody like Aaron Spelling, makes the shows happen, but his relationship to the shows themselves is much less intimate than what you see in television today. So I think that there are still people who get shows on television by virtue of their name and their power alone, but they tend to have these shows as more personal projects that they are intimately involved with, and they will go from one project to another. Aaron Sorkin would be an example of somebody like that. I don't know that Aaron Sorkin would ever have 4 or 5 series on TV at the same time, because he would have to be involved in all of them. So,
or David Kelly in the 90s and O's.
Yep, another great example, yes.
So, Quinn Martin, hopefully people will check him out. We're going to wrap up this show and then do another show on a totally different television personality, Mr. Fred Rogers. So Just let's, unless you have a final thing to say on Quinn Martin, we'll
I
move
would
on to.
all I would say to people is if they want to check a Quinn Martin series out, there are plenty of them that are available on DVD. There are some of them that are available on streaming. If you only check out one Quinn Martin series in your lifetime, watch The Fugitive. It's one of the greatest drama series of all time. After that, I would say The FBI, Cannon, Barnaby Jones, The Streets of San Francisco, The Invaders. Any of those series running up through there, I think you will find tremendously entertaining and enjoyable to watch.
And we'll be back soon with Mr. Rogers.